So we're transitioning today into the Bush years, after the year 2000. One of the things that I'm not going to mention here is the Y2K crisis, because uh, although it was incredibly important, it was one of those crises that didn't happen. People were freaking out in the year 2000 because they thought that there was a glitch within computer programming, where when they were entering in dates, all the dates were entered in two numbers as opposed to the four numbers, right? So 1999 would be entered just 99. And so there was this sense that once the year 2000 hit, all of a sudden all computers would think it was 1900 and airplanes would fall from the sky and all this stuff. And so people panicked and bought a lot of canned food and canned water and built bunkers when society collapsed. Then 2000 hit, society did not collapse. So with that, we as we move into the 2000s, obviously Clinton is leaving office, and so the election of 2000 was between Clinton's vice presidential candidate, a guy named Al Gore, who's most famous now for his whole inconvenient truth thing, and the son of former President George Bush, George Bush. It was kind of a messy campaign. Gore was viewed as somewhat unlikable and cold. And so he had this weird moment where he made out with his wife on stage. You can Google the video for it. It was super awkward to try and make himself seem more human and likable. And George Bush had a tendency to misspeak and to not be totally up on his facts in a lot of situations. So he was viewed as somewhat, again, unprepared and perhaps unqualified. He had been the former governor of Texas, I should say. So, um, honestly, probably the funniest SNL skit I've ever seen is the one about the debate between Bush and Gore. So Google that if you're interested. It's pretty fantastic. So, and it gives a good sense of both of the candidates' weaknesses. It was an incredibly, incredibly close election, as you can see here, right? You look at the electoral vote separated by five votes between the two of them. Neither one of them got a majority of the popular vote. There's a couple spoiler candidates, Nader specifically taking votes from Gore. But yeah, incredibly, incredibly close election to the point where they actually had a recount in the state of Florida. So the problem with Florida is that there were some issues with ballots not being counted because of the voting machines there. There were also some questions about changing polling times and closing specific polling stations. And so they started up a recount. The Gore campaign sued, arguing that there were irregularities. They started recounting the Florida vote. Oh, and of course, and so as they were going through and recounting the vote, the time was dragging on, and time was dragging on, and now it's December, and we still don't know who the president is. And so the Supreme Court ordered the recount stopped and gave Bush the victory. So George Bush becomes president, which was pretty controversial at the time, especially because his brother Jeb was the governor exclamation point was the governor of Florida at the time, and so there was some sense that, at least among Democrats, there was some sense that it was an illegally won election and that Jeb tipped the scales for George. So controversial start to the presidency, and but still, you know, Bush was able to pass some successful things within his first sort of the window of legislation. Because, of course, presidents can usually get a lot done within the beginning of their administration because of the momentum from getting elected. But they move through their terms, usually the speed of legislation slows down. So things Bush got passed right away. No Child Left Behind was a series of educational standards that have become kind of controversial over time. It basically tied federal funding to schools to so it tied federal funding to schools making what's called adequate yearly progress, basically improving performance over time, trying to hit specific benchmarks. So schools could theoretically lose federal funding if they weren't improving enough, which is kind of problematic both because for already high quality schools, there's a limit to how much harder you can push your students. And for schools that are struggling, cutting their funding is not a particularly great incentive to get them to do better. But struggling with educational accountability is something that we've been doing for a very long time, and No Child Left Behind was an attempt to push schools to provide a higher quality education. And then September 11th hit. So, within within 6 months of Bush getting inaugurated, the entire world changed. The whole sense of complacency of the 90s vanished as two planes flown by that were hijacked by terrorists from a group called Al Qaeda crashed into the World Trade Center towers in New York, and then one plane crashed into the Pentagon, and one plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania that we think was headed for the White House or the Capitol. So, terrorist attacks hitting the heart of American society, thousands of Americans were killed, and a guy named Osama bin Laden, who was the head of a terrorist group called Al Qaeda, claimed responsibility. And so now, all of a sudden, wherever we thought the 2000s were going to be about, they are now about something else, specifically the war on terror. So the United States switches to trying to fight sort of global terrorism and trying to become much more aware of these threats before deadly attacks happen. This leads to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. These are two separate wars fought for ostensibly the same reason. Afghanistan was ruled by a group called the Taliban, which were 100% helping to shelter Al Qaeda and providing a place for them to train. So in 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan, very quickly overthrew the Taliban, and tried to pacify the country, which they really struggled to do because Afghanistan is one incredibly has incredibly difficult terrain, which leads to many areas of the country being isolated. And secondarily, the central government of Afghanistan never had a significant amount of the central government of Afghanistan never really had all that much control over the outlying areas anyway. So even if we take Kabul, trying to push and to pacify the outer provinces becomes increasingly bloody and difficult. And so the war in Afghanistan drags on and on and on and on. And I don't think we're still fully out of Afghanistan. We're moving to get out of Afghanistan, but drags on. And then the war in Iraq was something different. The war in Iraq was basically was a mission to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And the motivation or the justification for this is complicated. They had argued that Saddam was funding terrorists, which he might have been, but probably not Al Qaeda. And they argued that Saddam was building weapons of mass destruction, which it turned out if he was, we didn't find them once we got in there. So the war in Iraq, we go in and topple Saddam Hussein and then try to set up a democratic government, which we have kind of struggled to do. And the power vacuum of Saddam falling may have given groups like ISIS the opportunity to arise in the Middle East. So, yeah. Obviously, the toppling of the government of Iraq caused massive instability, and building a coalition in Iraq is incredibly difficult because they're a divided country between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Saddam was a Sunni dictator, although he was mostly secular. He wasn't ruling by any sort of religious right. And 60 to 70% of the population, of the Muslim population, was left out of government when Saddam was in charge. And so once Saddam was toppled, the new Shia government then locked the Sunnis out, which again led partially to the rise of a group called ISIS. And then there's the Kurds up in northern Iraq who were locked out by basically everyone repeatedly. And yeah, it's complicated. So just know Iraq is somewhat of an unstable country today, and we have more or less failed to bring order/democracy to the Middle East. Despite the fact that George Bush at one point gave a speech on an aircraft carrier with a big mission accomplished banner behind him, and then the war dragged on for another decade and a half. So the optics of this, as they say, not the best. The other thing that September 11th created was the significant increase in incarceration of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, as you remember, is the naval base that we have on the island of Cuba. And we used what we call enhanced interrogation techniques to get information out of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay that some people have described as torture. And so the question of like whether or not we should be torturing prisoners and whether or not torture works is something that was raised because we more or less tortured prisoners in order to get them to give up information. And yeah, so the jury is still out on that. Certain people have said that they know 100% that torture works and they're going to bring torture back, but yet we have not started up the enhanced interrogation procedures again. We also passed what's called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is actually hilariously an acronym, which I'll put up there. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but what it really does is it gives significant leeway to the federal government to surveil and detain American citizens. We created the Department of Homeland Security, which is a new cabinet level government whose goal is to secure the homeland. And we significantly stepped up the intrusiveness of TSA screenings in order to try to prevent future attacks, at least by airplane. So, full body scans, you can thank September 11th and the Bush administration. Also, taking your shoes off before going through the metal detectors because someone tried to hide a bomb in their shoe at one point. So, yeah. Anyway, good stuff. With this, we get what's called the Bush Doctrine, which sort of broke apart the traditional alliance system. In that when we invaded Afghanistan, we had a broad sort of a broad coalition of nations with us. When we invaded Iraq, we were basically on our own. And so the United States, England came with us in the invasion of Iraq, but we basically decided that we're not going to try to build a global consensus anymore. We are now going to act more unilaterally in pursuing our goals. So the global public opinion about the United States declined significantly in the Bush years as we were seen as somewhat irresponsibly just going around and doing whatever we wanted. And the doctrine is pretty straightforward here. We're fighting terrorism. Either you give us a blank check of support for whatever we want to do, or you're helping global terrorism to destroy us. The other legacy of the Bush years were pretty deep tax cuts designed to sort of spur economic growth. Critics of these tax cuts argued that they were, one, probably too large and significantly increased the deficit, especially considering increased spending on defense after September 11th, and the fact that a significant portion of the tax cuts went to the wealthiest Americans. Uh, Bush and his Republican supporters would, of course, argue that he's doing more that these wealthy Americans are doing more to grow jobs and things like that. That the multiplier effect, as we say, of these tax cuts are larger because, of course, the gains that these wealthy Americans get are passed down to other people. But critics would argue again that it's unfair and that the Americans who most need the money are not getting much of it. So, the reason that these tax cuts were seen as necessary was the bursting of the dot com bubble very early into Bush's presidency. We had talked about the dot com bubble. We talked about the dot com bubble last time, where we got this massive growth in technology companies and internet companies. Well, that burst when we figured out that there was not a lot of revenue in a lot of these companies. The example that's always cited is the site's pets.com, which really did, or yeah, pets.com was valued at several $billion, despite the fact that it was not making any money and it wasn't selling any products. And people really didn't have a sense of how to make money off the internet. They could show that they had a lot of traffic, but then turning that, they didn't have like Google ads yet, or those type of monetary tools. And so, really trying to monetize the internet is something that we hadn't figured out in the early 2000s. So the bubble burst, there's a readjustment, and we go into a short recession, and the tax help to mitigate that recession. The problem, of course, is once you cut taxes, you can never raise them again because it's political suicide. And so the Bush tax cuts continued through the Obama years, and then significantly deeper tax cuts passed under Trump, which we'll talk about in a couple days. So, for the election of 2004, it's seen as both a referendum on Bush and sort of on the tax cuts and the education policy, and also the handling of September 11th. So, of course, Bush is going to be get his sorry Bush is going to be nominated by the Republican Party, and the Democrats are going to nominate former Secretary. Well, I guess he becomes Secretary of State after Senator John Kerry. John Kerry. So Bush is, of course, troubled by the fact that the war in Iraq is still dragging on. He had the mission accomplished moment, and the No Child Left Behind is not super popular. But he's bolstered by the rally around the flag effect of the terrorist attacks. Kerry is destroyed by what's called swift boating, or what became called swift boating. Swift boating is Also, okay, so Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is a group that attacked Kerry's Vietnam record. Kerry was a Vietnam veteran and became a prominent anti-war voice near the end of the Vietnam War. And so Swift Boat Veterans for Truth basically pushed a bunch of false statements about his war record out and then used them to attack him politically. And so, despite the fact that all of these statements were proved false, people chose to believe those statements and resisted fact checking. And Kerry was viewed as a liar and untrustworthy. So, swift voting is intentionally spreading false claims in order to politically damage someone. The end result of the election, again, incredibly close. Bush did get a slightly wider margin in 2004 and gets reelected without too much trouble. Kerry, it was pretty close, but the closeness of the electoral vote belies the fact that Bush wasn't really in danger in any of the battleground states. So George Bush is the second term. It's Ohio, this one that is the closest, but it was not all that close. And so John Kerry again loses, and George W. Bush gets a second term. Uh, During this time period, Bush becomes best known for what are known as Bushisms, which are statements that, well, I'll just put it up here. So, Bush once, he's kind of an awkward guy. He once gave Angela Merkel a back rub at a policy planning meeting for some reason, and you can see she didn't super appreciate that. He once choked on a pretzel on Air Force One and had to be forced. The pretzel had to be removed from his throat. Well, I'll just leave. This one speaks for itself. Honestly, these used to be much more shocking in the days before Donald Trump, because pretty much any sentence of Donald Trump that you write out looks more or less like this. And but in the early 90s, it was still somewhat shocking to a lot of people that Bush was not as articulate as you would expect from a president. Hurricane Katrina was sort of the low point of the Bush administration. It was a massive hurricane that hit New Orleans and Louisiana and flooded a significant portion of the city. This created economic and social devastation, of course. And the Bush administration was criticized for being slow with disaster aid, that FEMA did not come in as quickly as possible, and specifically that African American neighborhoods, which tended to be harder hit by the hurricane, got much less aid. And so, despite the fact that Bush claimed that he was helping, that his administration had a handle on the crisis. We had this really awkward moment here where, and you should 100% look up the video clip of this because Mike Myers, it's one of the most awkward moments you can imagine. Mike Myers sitting next to Kanye West as Kanye West goes off on a Kanye rant, which have now become, of course, increasingly commonplace. So there's a sense that the Bush administration was slow to act on Katrina as far as crisis management goes. And at the very end of the Bush years, we have the crash of the housing bubble. The housing bubble was growing throughout the 2000s, based as a speculative bubble in housing. People were taking out loans to buy houses that they couldn't afford, and then turning around and selling the houses for profit. Flipping houses became a really big business, and banks kept loaning to people because, of course, they make money off of the loans, despite the fact that it was clear that unless the person could sell the house, there was no way that they could pay back this loan. They were giving loans to people who had no assets, no income, and low credit, basically what are called ninja loans. And because of this, we got a speculative bubble in the housing market, which then burst, leaving a lot of people with houses that they couldn't afford, that were not worth enough to pay off the loans. So this is what we call underwater mortgages. So specifically in places like Florida and Arizona and Nevada, we got a lot of people who had houses that, again, just like in the Great Depression, even if they sold the house, they would still owe money on the loan because the value of the house tanked so significantly. But this housing crisis was bad enough, but it led to the Great Recession. It was one of the factors that led to the Great Recession because these mortgages didn't just hurt the people who had these houses. Because once people started defaulting, it became clear that the mortgages had been bundled up and then sold as investments, or slices of the mortgages had been sold as investments to just random people who were then also making money off of this housing market. And so not only did people who owned the houses get economically crushed, but people who had bought these investments, sometimes unknowingly bought these investments, also saw their savings dry up. And so the housing crash led to a general economic crash and entered into what's called the Great Recession, where we had to bail out mortgage companies and banks who were seen as the causes, the bad actors that led to this massive crash. So the bailout was probably necessary to keep the U.S. economy afloat, but was massively politically unpopular because these banks caused the price crisis, and now here we are bailing them out. So yeah, tons of people lost houses, which is of course also bad. And as we said, this is what we call the Great Recession, where the U.S. economy shrank by about $1 trillion, and it defined American society between 2007 and 2010 or 11, when we're mostly out of the Great Recession. So massive economic crash. And fortunately for Bush, of course, he's already had his 2 terms, so he's not running again. But clearly, the economic issues are going to be central as we move towards the election of 2008. So that's where we'll leave us today, with the Great Recession and Americans, many Americans, unemployed, underemployed, and having their savings wiped out. Also, a number of people who graduated with college degrees spent a significant amount of time cooking steaks and being servers and being underemployed because, man, the job market was really bad right around the Great Recession. So affected all parts of American society.